I can see all of you up there, I think. Thanks for having me. Yes, you may remember me earlier from that live demo. The temptation to write a swear word was very strong, but I resisted. So my name's Gemma O'Brien. I'm a typographer, illustrator, artist, and I literally live about 2 minutes down the street, so we can have the after party at my house. I also work from home, so my studio space originally was in this attic on the top floor of a 3-bedroom terrace. I've now expanded to an extra room, but it's kind of like my hub of whatever I'm working on at the time. So it's filled with drawings, sketches on the ceiling, anything that's relevant to the project. I've also managed to work out which indoor plants require the least amount of attention and care, and they are scattered around the place. So the majority of the work that I do starts by hand, but it's, you know, a balance between analog and digital. But I've always liked to think that what I'm trying to do sits somewhere between these kind of categories of art, illustration, and typography. And that's partly because within these areas, there's benefits, but there's also limitations. So I like the idea, for example, that typography has a really rich history and tradition. You know, the alphabet's been around for a long time and it isn't going anywhere. Illustration and design is kind of linked to society and responds to culture. So it's kind of current, it's based in trends, and art challenges you. So I like to think, how could I create lettering and typography that somewhere kind of floats between these three areas? Now, we were asked as creatives, as we were coming along to this conference, to think about the idea of fear in relation to creativity. And at first I was like, that's not something that I think of in the creative process. I'm very positive, I'll just get up and do it. But then I really looked back at the history of my kind of creative life, and I realized that different forms of fear have been scattered along the way. Anything from procrastination is a form of fear, putting it off to the last minute when there's actually no anxiety going on inside your head. My original decision not to study design was based from fear. So as I kind of went back over my creative career, I realized it actually was a big deal. So I started to think, how could you go from being someone driven by anxiety in the creative process to being a little bit more fearless? And I realized that the three things that I like to think about in relation to this idea is, firstly, to remind yourself that the amateur has nothing to lose. Originally, when I got interested in typography, I was an amateur, and it was purely passion. And you think someone says, oh, an amateur designer or an amateur typographer, and you think, oh, they just suck. But the reality is, an amateur is like from the word love, lover. You know, it's someone that's interested and passionate about something. They might not be professional, but you know, without that professional side of it, you have no expectations, and therefore you have less fear. So always remember that the amateur has nothing to lose. The second thing that I used in my process was to embrace the form and the process itself. So you can kind of put yourself into the work, and once you begin, the rest kind of carries on. And the third thing that I like to remind myself is take your work seriously, but not yourself seriously. And this was a quote from a dancer from, I think, back in the early 19th century, 20th century. And I just like it because, you know, you need to be playful, you need to have fun with what you're doing. So I'm going to take you through my story of how I started in these kind of 3 points along the way. Now let's go back to being an amateur. So this was one of my very early works in primary school. I always was interested in, you know, art and drawing. Obviously the idea of being a typographer didn't even exist in my mind as a, you know, 7 or 8-year-old. But Violet's Party, I mean, it needs a little bit of work on the letter spacing there, but this was one of my first forays into book design. So throughout school I was always creative, but then towards the end of high school, I kind of felt pressure from my school to do a smart career. And then, you know, art wasn't, you know, valued in the school that I went to, so I ended up going and studying law. Now, after a year of law school, I realized that was definitely not for me. So I switched, and instead of studying fine art, I decided to study design. Now, at this point, reflecting on my career, I think, well, I really wanted to be an artist. But having studied design and taken the path that I have now, I actually feel like I've got this kind of sense of the commercial world that actually shapes my work in a new direction. So I dropped out of law school, moved to Sydney and started studying design, and this is where I really became interested in typography. Now, if anyone's ever been to a letterpress printing studio before, you'd realize that they used to set type by hand. It's probably a whole generation that this is a big gap. Whereas I came in at the very beginning of computers, so we actually had an opportunity also at design school to kind of set type by hand. And at this point, typography was my passion, because suddenly it was physical, you could touch it up, you could pick it up and place it down. The drop-down font menus on the computer always seemed daunting to me, so suddenly it was a physical process. Now this was back in 2008, so at the time, typography blogs were just popping up. It was really becoming like a hip area within design, and I was like at the forefront of that happening in a wider sense of the design world. So as everyone did in the 2008, I started a blogger, and it was called For the Love of Type. So I decided this would be the place where I would channel my passion, and I took on this persona of Mrs. Eves. Now, you may know there's a font called Mrs. Eves, so I kind of came across this font and looked into the story behind it, and liked the idea of this person, who was a real person, Sarah Eves. Back in the 19th century, she was John Baskerville, Baskerville the font. She was his housewife, and after his wife passed away, they fell in love, and she apparently continued to print a lot of his types after he passed away. So in the folklore of typography, she was one of these first women involved in the type world. So I took on that name and just basically posted pictures of typography in my environment, a V from a dog in Venice Beach. I started to notice, how technology shaped the way the letter forms looked. So you kind of had this kind of stepping effect, which once was a limitation of the medium, and now is something you might try and recreate to get a vintage feel. I also was really interested in the theory of typography, and I would fill my kind of sketchbooks at university with illustrations. So this was just kind of a world of me sitting in my little studio and kind of studying away and channeling this love for typography. Then I did this university project where I covered my entire body in hand lettering, and this was like my big break in the typography world. At the time, this was a second-year graphics project where you had to kind of do an anti-graffiti campaign. So I did this project, put the process video online, and it was kind of at the beginning of viral videos as well. And I didn't think much of it. And then one day I opened my email and I had a letter from someone in Berlin. And they said, "Dear Gemma, you don't know me, but I thought you might be interested in reading this blog post that's been written about you. It's been written by the marketing manager of Font Shop. He writes a design blog that's read by a lot of Europeans, and it's quite critical of your work. Here it is. Here's a translation into English." So the blog post was called Amateur Designer and hat Sex mit Buchstaben, which translates to Amateur Designer has sex with letters. And it basically went on to be like, who is this Mrs. Eves? So, is she a student? Is she a professional? She's throwing away the rules of typography. Everything's derivative of Stefan Sagmeister, and basically just ripped it to shreds. And so I was just shocked, one, that someone other than my mother was looking at my blog, let alone, this kind of big influencer in the design world in Germany. So I kind of didn't think much of it. And then a few months later, I get a message in my Facebook message, and it's from Jürgen Siebert, and I remembered the name, and he's like, "Dear Gemma, you don't know me." And I'm like, "Yes, I do know you. Someone's told me about this." And he said, "Look, since writing that blog post, there was a huge reaction in the German design community. In the comments section, people were basically like, lighten up, maybe she's doing something interesting. Who cares if she's just a student?" And he basically said that it made him rethink what he had said, and that they were actually really interested in hearing about Australian typography, and would I like to come and speak at Typo Berlin. And I was like, oh my God. So I was 20 years old, still hadn't finished university, had no professional work, was basically just loved typography, and that was my credentials. So I said yes, and I said I'll come. So they flew me over to Berlin. This was the first ever design conference I spoke at. So I was 21. They recreated the Right Here, Right Now project, and this was like my first big break in the type world. And essentially, I came back to Australia, and I wanted to actually, build my network of skills, finish my degree, but this really kind of set the tone for my career from that point forward. So I came back to Sydney, and I actually ended up working in a few, art directing in a few 3D studios. So I worked at Animal Logic, and I worked at Fuel VFX, and I was doing more of a design team role where I was working with 3D artists, animators, and it was an amazing experience. I knew deep down that I was still interested in type and kind of the handmade process, but this was definitely for learning the way that big business works that I now use as a freelancer, it was definitely very helpful. So I'd kind of do lots of kids show animations, logos, this sort of thing. And then one job came along when I was working at Fuel VFX that was kind of the game changer and made me realize that I just loved that handmade process. And this one was for Taronga Zoo. So they basically came forward and said, we've got a new campaign that's this tagline's for the wild. And the idea is that they wanted people from the public to kind of come forward at Taronga Zoo and give a handprint pledge for the wild. And so we were asked to kind of create this little spot that would be going online that linked this kind of pledge and the animals all into one process. So I directed this and made all of the animations just me and one other art director. And this is the final piece.
Still the simplest way to put your name to a letter, a petition, to a contract, to a cause. Our cause is the wild. Every living wild animal. Because we believe that we all, humankind and animals, have a future together. We believe in a world that we can share. A world where all our wild species can make a comeback. Where the wild can remain wild. And we believe for this future to become reality, one species must lead us there. Ours. Taronga for the wild.
Oh, thank you. So what happened was after, doing 9 to 5 job in the design team, doing a lot of the work on the computer, this job came along, and basically for 2 weeks I was just doing watercolors, working with the After Effects person, and I realized this is really what I want to be doing. So from that point forward, I've been freelancing. So I left Fuel and have been working with an agency in Melbourne, and basically, as I said before, working out of my attic. A lot of kind of handmade typography focus. But what happened was, by the time this happened, from 2008 to 2012, typography had actually become even bigger than it was before. Kanye West was tweeting about it. So the typographers became celebrities. Seb Lester, I think it's even more now, has 100 million followers on Instagram. So the whole world of type and calligraphy and lettering has just, at this point, had a resurgence. And there was this return in the digital age to all of these different forms of, original sign painting, calligraphy. This video went viral. And I love that this video went viral because it's just some guys writing the bus stop sign. But it's so cool, and it should go viral. But the fact is that advertisers, brands realize that in the shift towards digital and the shift forward using, fonts and digital ways of working, you sometimes lose these lovely things that come with working by hand. And so what happened over the last 5 years is this idea of crafting authenticity. And a lot of the brands and a lot of the kind of companies that I work for wanted to embed something of the handmade in the final process, whether it was through customization and flourishes, or through kind of, working up these pieces so that they have a bit more character than what you can do solely working digitally. So a lot of the work was kind of being driven by these trends that were happening. Jessica Hish was huge, Dana Tanamachi in the chalk trend. So this was kind of shaping a lot of the commercial work that I was getting over the last kind of 3 years as well. The grand chalk trend of 2013 was like 80% of my work. Everyone wanted chalk typography. Letterpress came back. Sign painting, so all of these different forms that had some kind of link to the handmade were being reintroduced into the world of typography. So for me, I started to realize, as much as I loved working with these kind of trends and being able to actually work as a freelancer solely on typography, I wanted something that was unique to me. And so what I did was embrace the form and process to kind of escape the trends. And I realized that there's something that was unique to my process and what I enjoy is drawing. So trying to find a way to combine illustration and lettering as one. Often looking outside of the computer for the starting point for different forms of lettering. Spending lots of time adding detail. This was for the latest issue, or the previous issue of Playboy magazine, the first one with no nudes. Trying to find ways to combine typography and make it an image and something interesting in itself without kind of photography or any other elements. This was for an article about Genius for Nautilus magazine, so they wanted to focus only on the G. So trying to find ways that you could kind of take the lettering and bring it to life. How can you push it further in ways that you might originally stop with the font that you're working with and bring it to life as a picture in itself? And also the process of actually spending the time drawing was something that I found therapeutic and wanted to kind of bring back into the process. This was a job that was for Australian Geographic that was inspired by the Taronga Zoo job to celebrate the 30 greatest conservationists from the last 30 years. So after a lot of work that was driven by this drawing process, I realized that I wanted to have something in my practice that was a little bit faster, a little bit more immediate, and a little bit of a different style. So I went back to that idea of being an amateur and started playing around with calligraphy and writing. Now, basically, about 2 years ago, this wasn't even involved in my commercial process at all. It was always lettering, starting with the outlines, building up the shapes. So I essentially just went to the art store, watched tutorials online, bought a heap of brush pens, experimented with balsa wood, and I found new ways to create letter forms. So I would do my commercial jobs during the day and stay up really late at night and write things over and over again. Now, a lot of people would say, oh, do you practice by writing the alphabet every morning? But it was more about taking words, taking different brushes, and just playing with words in context. I always like to think that, typography links the language with the art. So it's always great to start with text in itself and use that to practice with. Anything that was hands-on with ink always had a really nice texture. So I'd take it from analog, scan it in, tweak it in the digital kind of spaces as well. And what this experimentation did was then kind of open up a whole new area of practice for me that led to commercial work for Angus and Julia Stone. And Troye Sivan kind of saw this, who's the new YouTube star, so using different brush techniques for those. So incorporating that handmade technique with the digital always seemed to create new areas within my work. And the biggest job that this kind of led to was for Kira and Cider. So they kind of saw some of my experimentation with brush lettering. This was with the balsa wood. And they said, can you hand paint 37 billboards for us? So I pretty much said yes, having never worked at that scale before and realizing the mammoth task of hand painting 37 billboards. So we ended up using an existing kind of sign painter's font as the base, projected chalk outlines, and then I just basically was a one-woman sweatshop there for 4 nights in a row. But the funniest thing about this project was, with many projects these days, another element of authenticity is to have the behind the scenes. We want the artwork, but we also want the behind the scenes process of making it. So they made a little video of me going up to the final billboard in Surrey Hills, going up on the scissor lift and painting it in real life. Now, the problem was I didn't have my scissor lift license. So they said, you have to have a man in the scissor lift operating it for you at all times. I'm like, that's cool, that's cool. And then they're like, but we want to get a shot of Gemma at the end, the creative director. We want a shot of Gemma, and we don't want the guy. And so he's like, that's cool, I can just lie down. And it was like raining, and I'm like, really? So in the final video, you can see him right there. He's like, he was such a good sport. He was like literally lying in a pool of water. So what ended up happening from that job was suddenly I could do large scale. So, by saying yes and taking that leap, suddenly I had another whole area of practice within my work. So this pretty much led to the mural era, which has defined my practice for the last 2 years now. So kind of anything from taking the small scale brush stuff and scaling it up. A lot of the time I work with a projector to get the scale. And it was almost, again, another level of authenticity, because not only do you get the sense of artwork in a space, but you have a sense of the human scale, the process. So when you're flicking through your phone and seeing everything as an image, suddenly it has context. And this is something that's just being continually brought back. How can we make it a little bit more human? I've done a lot of work with Volcom Stone. This was one of the first large-scale murals that I did in Sydney for an event. And often with this one, for example, 2 nights of painting, 1 night for the event, then painted over white. This is at their art loft in Costa Mesa. An Aussie reference, telling me streaming for the Curvy exhibition. And more recently, this was one for Westfield. So if you go to Westfield Chatswood, it's great to do a talk in the city where I often paint things, so you can kind of see this in real life. And this was at the entrance for a food court. So the quote was, "People who love to eat are always the best people." And most recently, literally just finished this one last night for Oreo Wonderfield. And what I realized is from doing these kind of large-scale commercial project murals is that I really liked the idea of painting it over white at the end. And it comes back to that idea of the experience is everything. So I started to do a lot of exhibitions where it was, outside the constraints of a commercial project, you could work in a gallery space, and that was an opportunity for me to push the level of detail I could have in my typography. It kind of challenged the idea that the printing tradition is limited to the page. So suddenly you have these intricate, detailed letters that you might have originally only seen as a drop cap in a kind of manuscript on this huge, large scale. So this was an exhibition that I did at China Heights in Sydney. And often they're up for about, this one was up for 3 nights, and then the whole space was painted white again. And so the idea that you have to kind of be there, experience it, and then it's gone is something that you can kind of remember. And the most recent exhibition was kind of taking this idea of the digital interactions that we have on a daily basis and using that as the beginning text for the project. So this first artwork was taken from the robot capture test, where it says, prove you're human, and you have to kind of fill out those little forms or pick the picture which has the grass in it. And so I liked the idea that, out of context, prove you're human can kind of speak to something more about the human experience and legacy. And so that was one of the elements. And then in the central block, it said, re-establishing lost connection, which has popped up on a few times on the Facebook app. So I like the idea that they could kind of link back to something that was human, but also this kind of mundane language, clicking OK a million times a day, remember me when you're saving your information. And so outside of the commercial work, the illustration, and the large-scale murals, I realized that there has to be a bit of fun and there has to be a bit of playfulness in what you do. And so we're coming back to the idea to take your work seriously, but not yourself. And the last project I want to show you happened when I was flying on a plane from Sydney to Wellington. And it's a project that has since been labelled You Make Me Sick. But it all started with one flight. So I was flying from Sydney to Wellington. I thought, I've got a little pencil, I might just write fully sick. So I posted it on Facebook, and I arrived in New Zealand. I get this call from my mum. She's like, Gemma, are you okay? I'm like, yeah. She's like, your dad just called. He said you were feeling unwell. You posted something on the internet about it. I'm like, Mum, it's a joke. And she kind of looked at the picture and said, oh, I see. So Dad was a bit slow to the game. But from that point forward, every time I would fly, and I was doing a lot of workshops at the time, I would think of a puke pun, write it on the sick bag during the flight, and then leave it in the seat. This was at the time that Daft Punk brought out their new album, so that was Get Lucky, Get Chucky. So it started to be relevant to pop culture references of the time, or the location I was traveling. This was when I went to Japan. And so after doing a few, I decided that it was a good time to change my pseudonym from Mrs. Eves to Mrs. Heaves. And so I would sign them off with Mrs. Heaves, and I started the hashtag Spew Bag Challenge. So I kind of asked people who were flying that they could also participate and do their own puke puns. They just had to leave it in the seat at the end. But they kept on coming from my travels. I gave this one to my mum as a gift. Chuck Norris needed no alteration. So the idea was that you had to create it in the duration of the flight. So the more long-haul international flights, you could make something more detailed. And so after a year, I probably put the first 4 and left them in the seat. And then when it started to get such a big following on social media, I thought I should probably keep these for something. And at the end of the year, I had an exhibition called You Make Me Sick. I created some new puke bags specifically for the show. So there was Rage Against the Cuisine, Hayley's Vomit. And what ended up happening was Qantas ended up coming to the exhibition and said, look, we'd love to partner with you to do something with this sick bag art. And I ended up doing a project with them. They said, we love the whole idea, only can we just have nothing about spew or being sick? That's kind of the whole thing. But what ended up happening was it was great because it meant the spew bag challenge could live as its own thing, and I ended up doing more of a creative destination-based artwork for their project. So if you want to see the rest of the spew bags I've created, you can have a look on the spewbagchallenge.tumblr.com, or if you go onto the hashtag, it's like literally become a whole thing in itself on Instagram now. I think there's about 1,000 posts from people all around the world who are traveling and drawing on sick bags. So if you see someone next to you, you can be like, yeah, on the plane. And so that's the final project. So as I said before, you know, fear wasn't something I ever kind of imagined within my creative process, but the idea of reminding myself that, you know, once you get stuck in a rut, you can go back to being an amateur, to embrace the form and process, and not to take yourself seriously, but to take your work seriously. So thanks very much.